They laughed when she walked in on Memorial Day mop bucket squeaking floor, still wet from her shift. Tamsin Varela, she said quietly. 59. Used to pack field rations, now I clean after briefings. Her hands never let go of that polished dog tag, still whole and still private. Ever had a moment where silence said more than your title? Let me know what they didn't see when they looked at you. She walked into the room and no one looked up. Not a nod, not a murmured greeting, just the whir of the ceiling fan above and the shuffle of papers below. Her shoes barely made a sound on the tile floor. I only noticed her because she didn't interrupt the silence, she slipped into it, like someone who'd done that many times before. There was something about the way she moved, economical, but not rushed. She signed in with a blue civilian badge, one of those laminated cards we hand out to contractors and outsiders. Her name wasn't spoken, not even by the petty officer logging attendance. She looked over the seats without hesitation and chose the farthest one from the projection screen. I remember thinking either she's smart enough to watch everyone from the back, or she's used to not being seen. It was spring in Pensacola, which meant the air inside the old boardroom was as heavy as the air outside, humid, tinged with salt, and thick enough to press against your collar. The ceiling fan overhead groaned with every rotation, spinning just slowly enough to be useless. I was already sweating through my undershirt, even in stillness. Lieutenant McKinnon, seated 2 chairs over from me, leaned back and muttered, "Another contractor." Great. Not under his breath either. Just loud enough to let the joke hang in the air. She didn't respond. She opened a plain manila folder and began arranging her notes. They were handwritten, tight, blocky script, no labels, no printed headers. That struck me. Most people come in with PowerPoints and color-coded tabs. She came with ink. I noticed, too, the scarf she wore despite the heat. A modest one, navy and fraying at the edges. At one point, she reached up and adjusted it slightly, her fingers brushing against something underneath. That's when I saw the faint glint, silver thin, not quite a necklace. It flashed once and disappeared back beneath the scarf, like a coin sliding through a slot. Later, I'd know it by its weight. CMDR Greaves entered precisely at 0900 like he always did. He didn't acknowledge her either. Not out of malice, I don't think he was the kind of man who believed in rank and routine. If you weren't on his list, you didn't exist. "Let's begin," he said, flipping his binder open. The overhead projector buzzed to life, casting dull blue slides on the wall. McKinnon took the opportunity to smirk in her direction, already halfway into a side conversation with someone behind him. The meeting rolled forward. Logistics updates, funding projections, unit readiness charts, all the usual military minutiae. She didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't even write much after the initial flurry. She just listened. I watched her more than I should have. Something about her stillness made me uncomfortable. It was intentional, like a radio held on mute. Then, 28 minutes into the meeting, while Greaves was detailing satellite coordination failures, she raised her hand. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't wave or clear her throat. She just lifted her fingers slightly off the folder, like she was asking to borrow a pen. Greaves paused. "Yes," he asked, tone clipped. Her voice was calm but not soft. "Has latency variance been tested between the Mayport and Key West relays, I ask? Because this," she tapped her notes, "once, shows pattern interruptions at similar intervals to those reported in the Arctic deployments, suggesting it's not regional but systemic." The room froze. Even McKinnon stopped chewing his gum. Greaves stared at her, then blinked. "Proceed." No one laughed. No one argued. She didn't smile. 10 minutes later, the meeting ended with none of the usual chatter. As people stood and collected their binders, I lingered behind. I wanted, no needed to see what she did next. That's when I saw it. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small packet of tissues, and quietly wiped down her chair. Not like someone disgusted, like someone following procedure. Habitual. Precise. She folded the tissue neatly and tucked it into a side pocket, then left the room without looking at anyone. No one introduced her. Not Greaves, not McKinnon, not the officer at the door. But I remembered her name. Tamsin Varela. It was written on her badge, in faded ink, barely legible. But someone had tried to cover the CMDR prefix with a strip of blue tape, and that more than anything made me sit up straighter. The next day, her seat was taken. Not a word exchanged. No nameplate moved. Just a lukewarm coffee cup already sitting there, lid off, cream ring drying at the edge. McKinnon had plopped into it without hesitation, tossing his binder across the adjacent chair, as if claiming a campsite. No one apologized. Tamsin entered quietly, as she had the day before, still wearing that frayed scarf, despite the rising Florida heat. She paused near the threshold, scanning the room once, and then turned without comment toward the back row. Her hands didn't fumble. Her eyes didn't linger. But she didn't sit. Not right away. You learn to recognize those who always arrive early. When they're suddenly not seated when they're made to stand, it leaves a ripple. This room was smaller than the one yesterday. No windows. A ceiling low enough to touch if you stretched. Fluorescent strip lights buzzed overhead, one of them flickering just enough to be maddening. The air conditioning worked barely, but only on the left side. The rest of us sat in the slow bake. She finally took the farthest seat closest to the fire exit. A metal chair with a bent leg and a stain on the cushion. Her badge again read Tamsin Varela, but someone had etched a crease through the lamination as if it had been folded in half and hastily pressed flat. McKinnon was in full form today, pretending to take notes while muttering snide remarks. Nice of the contractor to join us. Maybe she'll audit the vending machines next. Greaves ignored him. As usual. He perched near the front, scanning the screen with surgical disinterest. His pen never clicked, his face never changed. I sat 2 seats down from her this time, closer than I meant to. Maybe I was curious, or maybe I'd just grown tired of pretending I didn't notice the shifts in air when she entered. She didn't make noise. She didn't command attention. But presence isn't always about volume. Sometimes it's what remains when everything else gets quiet. The presenter, a junior logistics officer, was already 10 minutes into a disjointed explanation about shipment delays and error margins when Tamsin reached into her bag. She slid a slim folder across the table toward the center without fanfare. The pages inside were printed, but they bore small handwritten footnotes in the margins. Crisp, small script, not corrections, clarifications. Source codes, GPS variances, even meteorological overlays from storm systems I hadn't seen in any clearance-level packet. I leaned slightly to read the top page. The heading Cross-Regional Impact Assessment, Eastern Relay Hubs. There were timestamps, watermarks, footnotes labeled with strings I recognized from internal audit systems, but those records weren't public. Not even to me. McKinnon craned his neck. "Contractors are allowed to submit data now," he asked loudly. "Should I get my Uber driver to proof these charts?" No one laughed. Not even the comms specialist seated near the back who normally giggled at everything. Greaves didn't answer. He just waved a hand in the presenter's direction, signaling to move on. Tamsin didn't blink. She didn't look at McKinnon. She didn't shift her body. Her pen tapped once against the table and went still. The meeting dragged forward. Numbers blurred. Acronyms piled. I found myself watching her again. It wasn't fascination. Not exactly. It was something closer to discomfort, like realizing too late that you'd misjudged a person and didn't know how to reset. Then she moved. It was small, barely anything. She made a note mid-slide, folded it once, and handed it silently to the presenter during a brief pause. No one noticed, except me. 10 minutes later, the presenter stopped mid-sentence, blinked at the projection, and muttered, "Correction. This data model is incomplete. I've been handed updated overlays that render the assumptions void." He cleared his throat. "We'll circulate the new sheet post-briefing." McKinnon coughed. "Was that in the vending machine packet?" Still no laughter. Greaves looked up from his notes for the first time. He didn't smile. He didn't scold. He simply nodded once in Tamsin's direction and said, "Noted. Let's continue." No applause. No thank you. She didn't ask for either. When the meeting adjourned, people scattered like they always did off to their silos and inboxes. Conversations started mid-hallway, stopped mid-escalator. I lingered again. Old habit. Maybe newer now. I watched her gather her folder, slowly tapping the edges to square them. She didn't rush. Her fingers were steady. She stood, wrapped the scarf tighter around her neck, and walked toward the exit. McKinnon stood by the doorway, arms crossed, pretending to read something on his phone. He didn't speak, just followed her with his eyes as she passed. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. Outside, the sun had dipped lower. The light came in sideways, slanting through the narrow glass in the door. It caught the corner of her scarf as she stepped beyond its reach. In that moment, I noticed something I hadn't before. The scarf wasn't knotted. It was folded, layered precisely over the front of her chest, like a ritual, like armor, and underneath it, that faint glint of silver. Still there, still silent, still hers. He placed a paper cup of coffee in front of her and said, "Still black, no sugar." It was the kind of greeting that didn't ask for confirmation. A quiet offering from someone who'd done this before, maybe often, maybe long ago. His hands trembled as he let go of the cup, but his voice didn't. We were in the base cafeteria, the quiet corner near the vending machines where the strip lights buzzed a little louder and the floor tiles hadn't been waxed in years. The smell was a mix of plastic tray residue and slightly burned toast. No one lingered long in that part of the room unless they meant to talk without being seen. I had brought my own coffee, too sweet out of habit, and sat 3 tables over pretending to scroll through my inbox. I recognized the man as soon as he approached her. Doc Arguelles, retired field medic. Gray around the edges, now slightly stooped, but those eyes still held the kind of clarity you didn't forget. Tamsin looked up. For a second, just a breath, her face softened. No smile, but something less tight around the jaw. "You shouldn't be out here," she murmured. He shrugged. "Still got base access on Tuesdays. And I figured you wouldn't say no to decent coffee." She didn't thank him. She just accepted the cup and cradled it in both hands. Steam curled up and softened the edge of her scarf. Doc reached into the side pocket of his windbreaker, slow and deliberate. He pulled out a folded napkin, slid it across the table. Inside, wrapped with more care than most official mail I'd seen, was half of a dog tag. Not cut, broken. The metal was old, scratched a name barely legible on its curved edge. She looked at it for a long time before speaking. "That night, I almost didn't make it back for you." Doc nodded. "But you did. And not just for me. 3 of us. You brought all 3 back, left nothing behind. That wasn't the plan. I know." He tilted his head slightly. "But that's what made you a leader. I wasn't supposed to be. Maybe not on paper. There was a beat of silence between them heavier than any words. I watched their hands, not their eyes. Hers steady thumb tracing the rim of the coffee cup. His still trembling, now clutching the edge of the table like the memory required support. I pretended to scroll through a memo I'd already read. The screen dimmed. I didn't adjust it. She always sat quiet like this, Doc said after a moment, turning just slightly in his chair, addressing the air between us as much as her. Back then, too, quiet at first. Then she'd speak, and the whole camp would snap straight. We knew she'd seen things we hadn't, lost things we still carried. She didn't interrupt. She just let him talk. The kind of leader, he said, who made the job easier for people like me. Tamsin's voice was almost too low to hear. I didn't want to lead. I just didn't leave people behind. Doc smiled. It wasn't wide. But it was real, that's the difference. A tray clattered behind me, someone at the vending machine fumbling a bottle. I turned reflexively and saw McKinnon walking past on the far side of the cafeteria, laughing with 2 other officers. He didn't glance our way, didn't recognize the old medic seated across from her. That didn't surprise me. History's easy to miss when it's quiet and doesn't advertise itself. Doc waited until the room thinned again. Then he pushed the folded napkin closer. "You'll be asked to speak soon," he said. "I won't." "Then let this do it for you." He tapped the metal inside light enough to make a dull chime. Tamsin didn't touch it. She didn't protest either. She just looked at him, looked through him, and in that moment I saw something flicker across her face. Not pain, not pride. Something closer to fatigue wrapped around memory. Doc stood, his fingers brushing the rim of his coffee cup as he collected it. "You gave us more than a name to come home with," he said. "Don't forget that." She didn't answer. I waited until he left. Then I watched her wrap the dog tag half back into the napkin. Folded once. Then again. Then a third time. Precise. Her hands didn't shake. It fell like a coin dropped on a tomb. A small, sudden clang, sharp, metallic, cutting through the hush of morning chatter like it didn't belong there. Or maybe like it did too exactly. That sound metal on stone had weight. We were in the corridor outside briefing room 2A. The floors were marble cold and echo-prone. Everything echoed in that wing of the building, even your thoughts. Tall, vertical windows let the sunlight in at an angle sharp enough to throw long lines across the tile. The air always smelled faintly of old paper and the bitter tang of gun oil. No one rushed in this hallway. It encouraged silence procession. Except McKinnon. He barreled down the corridor like he owned it, dress shoes loud on the tile, coffee sloshing in his hand. And as he passed by Tamsin, who was standing quietly near the wall, adjusting her folder, he made a sharp pivot. Not enough to knock her over, just enough to knock something loose. Her scarf shifted, not fully just enough that the chain underneath caught air. The silver flashed once and then clink. The tag hit the tile. It spun once before settling, catching the morning light. He stopped. "Oh," he said, tone mocking surprise. "Was that yours?" He crouched to pick it up before she could. Lifted it between 2 fingers like he'd found a lost bolt. This from a surplus store. Tamsin looked at him. Not hard, not wounded. Just looked. "No," she said. "Not anymore." She reached out, palm open. He hesitated just long enough for the silence to become crowded. Then he placed it into her hand with exaggerated care. I watched his fingers twitch, as if wanting to let it drop again, but thinking better of it. She didn't brush it off. She didn't check for scratches. She tucked the tag into a small leather case pulled from her folder, brown-worn, stitched by hand. It was shaped like a badge wallet, but thinner, purpose-built. She snapped it shut and slid it away. McKinnon looked like he was about to say something else. But that's when CMDR Greaves appeared. Varela Greaves said, voice clipped, "My office. 0800 tomorrow. We'll be conducting a formal review of your credentials." Tamsin didn't react. Not a flinch. She simply nodded once and returned her scarf to its place. Greaves didn't wait for confirmation. He walked off down the corridor without looking back. McKinnon cleared his throat. "Just doing my job, sir," he said to no one in particular. Maybe hoping someone would laugh. No one did. Not even me. Because by then I'd stopped pretending I was just observing. I was 2 seats behind her the day she first walked in. I was there when her scarf caught the light. I'd seen her rewrite an entire data model with one footnoted report. And now I watched her reclaim something quietly, with no speeches, just reclaim it. She turned and walked away. Her shoes were soft-soled, but in that corridor even soft sounds echo. Each footstep followed her out like punctuation. McKinnon stood still, smirk frozen somewhere between amusement and confusion. I should have gone the other way. I had a meeting in 15 minutes, 2 floors down. But I didn't. Instead, I stood in that corridor a little longer, staring at the polished stone where the dog tag had landed. It wasn't just about the chain or the gesture or the way he said surplus like it tasted bad. It was the sound. Disrespect, it turns out, sometimes has an acoustics problem. It rings. Later that afternoon, a message hit my inbox. No subject line. Just, "Clay Bordeaux will be the assigned internal auditor for the credential hearing 0800 tomorrow RM4C. I read it twice. Then a third time. It wasn't an invitation. It was a role. And as my finger hovered over the archive button, I realized something that made my stomach shift. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was on the record. She walked into the room with a small wooden box. No lawyer, no prepared statement, no stack of affidavits or slick presentation materials. Just that box held steady in both hands, like it meant something far older than any of us sitting there wanted to admit. The hearing room at Pensacola HQ wasn't grand, but it pretended to be. Dark paneled walls framed brass Navy plaques from 3 wars ago. The carpet was threadbare in places, but the ceiling rose too high to allow casual speech. You had to speak with purpose or your words got lost in the echo. The air held that thick, over-conditioned stillness, too cool for Florida in spring, too heavy for clear thinking. Greaves sat at the head of the table, spine straight, palms folded. His suit was 1 degree darker than usual, and he looked paler than I'd seen him. McKinnon flanked his left jacket open, jaw set, but there was something brittle behind the tightness. Confidence worn thin. To Greaves's right sat Rear Admiral Greystone, older, heavier, quiet. He hadn't spoken when he entered, hadn't offered pleasantries. He simply nodded to the room and waited. And me, I sat with the recording terminal. Clay Boudreau, internal audit officer, assigned note-taker and observer of things most people pretend not to see. I clicked the record tab and typed the heading, Internal Hearing Clearance Verification. Varela Tamsin. RO800 HR as Tamsin placed the box on the table. It wasn't large, about the size of a sandwich container. Polished wood, rounded corners, the kind you see in family garages, holding medals or fading letters. She didn't open it right away, just looked at Greaves and said, "You called this review, I'm here." Greaves cleared his throat. "Ms. Varela, please state your position and the reason for access to joint operations records beyond your clearance level." Tamsin remained standing. I've never requested special access. The documents referenced were familiar, not classified. Greaves blinked. Familiar how? She opened the box. The lid creaked, not from rust, but age. Inside sat a single item, a dog tag. Not dangling, not loose. It was laid on black felt, centered with surgical precision. It gleamed, not like the chain I'd seen beneath her scarf. This one was heavier, squared slightly at the edges. On its face was an engraved string of alphanumerics, no name, no date, no unit explicitly named. Just a code. But I knew enough to tell it wasn't arbitrary. Greystone leaned forward for the first time. His chair creaked under the motion. His eyes narrowed. That is not a personal ID tag. Greaves didn't answer. Greystone reached into his own folder, one I hadn't seen him open before, and pulled a laminated sheet. He compared something for a moment, then spoke clearly so no one could misunderstand. This is a command-issued identifier used exclusively for SEAL Team 6 field certification, carried only by certified lead operators. These are untraceable by design. McKinnon shifted in his seat. She could have found it, False Greystone said, flat and cold. These are never lost, never sold. They're either retrieved or destroyed. The presence of this intact implies not only ownership, but authorization. Greaves stiffened. He looked at Tamsin like he was seeing her for the first time. She said nothing. Greystone asked, "Where did you acquire this, Ms. Varela?" "I didn't acquire it," she said, voice steady. "It was issued." "To you?" She didn't blink. "Yes." McKinnon muttered something, but it was lost under the weight of the room. Tamsin gently removed the tag from the felt lining. It made a soft metallic sound, not like a jangle, but the quiet thunk of something real being handled with care. She placed it on the table. The tag didn't slide. It landed, and it stayed. "I've never asked to speak," she said. "Not in the rooms where rank mattered more than work. Not when the contractors list got reprinted every month. Not when someone tried to call what I remembered a misfile." She touched the box lid, but didn't close it yet. "This speaks louder." Silence held. I could hear my own heartbeat, and it wasn't the coffee's fault. Greystone finally turned to me. "Mark it," he said, nodding at the recorder. I hesitated. "Just a second." Then I typed Exhibit A, verified. My hands shook as I hit return. Tamsin reached for the tag, returned it to the felt, and this time closed the lid. No snap. Just the hush of polished wood meeting itself again. She sat. I didn't realize until then that she hadn't sat since she entered. 20 minutes had passed. The panel room hadn't emptied. No one had moved, really. A few had blinked. One junior tech at the back had tried to cough and failed. But mostly, it was quiet. The kind of quiet you get after a controlled explosion, when nothing's broken, but the shape of the room feels different. The light had shifted. Florida sun can be dramatic when it wants to be. Now it poured directly through the east window, cutting across the polished table, and fell in a perfect square over Tamsin's chair. The brass plaques on the far wall no longer reflected it. Her shoulders did. She didn't seem to notice. Greystone stood. The chair made a soft scraping sound as it moved back, but no one dared look away. The man wore 4 stars sewn into a collar so worn they looked understated. He walked with the kind of deliberation that told you he'd learned patience from danger, not meetings. His leather shoes tapped once, twice, and then stopped in the center of the room. He turned to her, and he saluted. Not a nod, not a quiet hand gesture under the table. A full regulation, straight-spined salute, right hand sharp held firm until answered. No one told him to do it. No protocol required it. In that room, in that moment, with all the weight of rank pressing down from the ceiling, he did it anyway. And Tamsin stood. The motion was clean. No hesitation. She matched his salute with precision, no embellishment, no expression. It was the kind of return you only see in people who still believe in what the gesture means. I stopped typing. My fingers had frozen mid-keystroke. Greystone held the posture for one more beat. Then he let it drop. "Commander Varella's assessment stands," he said, addressing the room, but looking only at her. "So does her rank." I heard the sound of breath catching Greaves. He stood too now, awkward pale. "Sir, You're dismissed from evaluation duty," Greystone said without turning. "Effective immediately." Greaves opened his mouth, closed it again. McKinnon didn't move. The air had changed. The temperature hadn't, but I swear it was warmer. Like the humidity had dropped just enough to let us all breathe again, but differently. Like the molecules knew they weren't allowed to lie anymore. McKinnon finally shifted in his chair. He stood slower than Greaves, but with more effort, like someone trying to not be seen leaving a church early. Greystone looked at me next. "Mr. Boudreau." I snapped to attention. Not a salute. Just that internal jerk of someone caught daydreaming. "Yes, Admiral." "You've been recording all of this?" "Yes, sir. Keep it clean. Keep it accurate. And mark what just occurred." I nodded. My hand still hovering above the keyboard made the mistake of shaking. Greystone returned to his seat. Tamsin hadn't sat back down. She picked up her box, tucked it under her arm, and stepped around the table. No one blocked her path. No one asked for clarification. She passed me on the way out. Paused, not for long. Just a moment enough to glance at my notebook and the open laptop screen. "Hope your notes are clean, Clay." I couldn't think of a response before she was gone. They weren't clean. I'd been pressing too hard on the keys. Several lines had duplicate entries from where I'd frozen, unblinking, as the room had changed shape around me. I sat there, staring at the last line I had typed. "Salute initiated, Rear Admiral G. CDR. Varela. Returned." Exact, I didn't backspace. I didn't add quotes or timestamps or formalities. Sometimes the system forgets its own spine. Today it remembered. We didn't toast. We didn't shake hands or slap backs or talk louder than we needed to. We just sat in the break room, two men with more memory than appetite, letting the silence breathe for us. The fluorescent bulb above flickered every few seconds, enough to notice, not enough to complain. The vending machine hummed like it was whispering to itself. A stale coffee pot sat half-drained on the burner. Nobody had made a fresh batch since morning, but we poured from it anyway. Doc Arguelles handed me a chipped mug and sat down with a long exhale that whistled through his teeth. His hands were quieter now, though not steady. They hovered around the rim of his own cup like he needed to be sure it was real. Outside, the air was heavy. You could smell the Gulf even from here, salt and humid quiet. Inside, the only scent was scorched caffeine and old vinyl. "She's not coming," I said without looking at him. Doc chuckled once, low and warm. "No, she isn't. She doesn't do the farewell lap. Never did." I leaned back, chair creaking under me. She said one line. Just one. That was enough to undo everything in that room. Doc looked down, then reached into his wallet, one of those thick, soft leather ones that looked older than the coffee maker. He pulled out a sliver of metal. "This one came back broken," he said, placing it on the table between us. "But she didn't let it end that way. Half a dog tag. jagged on one side like it had been snapped under pressure rather than cut clean. There were still numbers visible. I didn't read them. She gave me the other half, I said slowly. He nodded. You weren't supposed to see that. You weren't supposed to know. Why did she show me? Doc didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of the bitter coffee, then closed his eyes just briefly. Because you didn't flinch. When they tried to erase her, you just kept your notes straight. You let her speak without stepping in. You saw Clay. Not everyone sees. The vending machine clicked as if agreeing. I used to think she was cold, I admitted. Detached. Too quiet. She is, he said. But it's earned. Every time she opened her mouth in uniform, someone tried to make it about their comfort, not her truth. So she stopped giving them the benefit. He reached into a side folder paper, no barcode, just rubber band wrapped twice. This'll help with your appendix, he said, sliding it over. I opened it. Field report signed in a hand I didn't recognize but dated over 10 years ago. Circled in red field triage extraction under indirect fire, Sergeant. Varela led evac of 3 personnel, including 1 unconscious medic. Refused exfil until perimeter was cleared. She never put that in her official eval, I said, scanning the faded type. Nope, Doc replied. Didn't want medals. Wanted exits. We didn't speak for a while. I read through another paragraph. The paper smelled faintly of glue and dust, and somewhere in the corner of the room, the vending machine stuttered and reset. Doc didn't look up. He just cradled the mug in both hands like it held something heavier than coffee. You think they'll remember? I asked. They already do, he said. I tilted my head. He didn't clarify. Just leaned back and nodded at the half tag between us. She was never supposed to lead, he said, almost a whisper. She just didn't leave anyone behind. That line stuck. Not for the drama of it. Not even for the loyalty it implied. It stuck because it wasn't said with admiration. It was said like a weather report. Something true, inevitable, unembellished. I folded the folder shut gently. What should I do with this? Doc smiled without his teeth. You're the last one she let see behind the curtain. He stood slower than before, but without hesitation. Make it count. Then he walked out, leaving the mug and the tag and the silence behind him. I stayed. The vending machine clicked again. The coffee pot wheezed. The lights flickered once steadied. And I began to type. It sat in the center of the room, silent, lit from below, and encased in glass that caught the morning sun like stained memory. No caption, no timeline, no commendation plaque. Just the tag, the box, and the space around it like breath held in tribute. I hadn't planned to stay long. The ceremony was done an hour ago. Most had already filed out with small cups of punch and vague smiles, unsure if they'd been at a dedication or a quiet apology. But I lingered, not because I was assigned, not because anyone asked me to. The room still smelled of new paint and lemon floor wax. Rows of frames lined the wall behind me, photos, names, ribbons behind plexiglass, all aligned, tidy, official. But this display wasn't in line. It stood slightly apart. A simple oak pedestal, a square of cloth under the case, and inside a small wooden box open just enough to show the curve of a military dog tag. Engraving worn smooth, unreadable unless you already knew what it said, which most didn't. And that was the point. My transcript lay beside it, folded open at the middle crease. I recognized the page verified under direct command. Rear Admiral Greystone typed, signed, filed, archived, not framed, not highlighted, just there. Visitors came in pairs or alone. A man in a baseball cap with a navel pin, a woman pushing a stroller. Two teenagers chewing gum too loudly until they reached the exhibit, and then oddly not. They paused, looked, stepped back. No flash photos. No questions. Then a boy, maybe 8, tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed at the case. Who was she, he asked. The mother looked at the tag for a moment, tilting her head, reading nothing. Then she smiled and said softly, "One of ours." That was it. No lecture. No historical rundown. Just that one of ours. The boy nodded like that explained enough, and they moved on. I stood there a while longer, holding the folded paper I hadn't shown anyone. Not official, not reviewed. Just a note typed late the night before while I thought about her silence more than her rank. I unfolded it carefully, then placed it on the wood base of the case. Still serving, even unseen. I stepped back. The light from the high windows shifted across the floor, casting long lines of sun over the tiles. The glass reflected the beam gently, not brightly, like it didn't want to interrupt. Doc sat near the rear exit. He hadn't moved much, just held his cap in his lap, thumb tracing the stitching like prayer beads. He didn't look up when I nodded, but I knew he saw me. Greaves wasn't there. Never showed. McKinnon had briefly uniform-pressed expression blank. He stood in the far corner by the fire exit and didn't approach the display. But I saw his shoulders lower just slightly before he turned and left. Not regret. Not quite. But something near it. And she wasn't here. Of course she wasn't. The exhibit was curated without her input. But I knew she knew. Doc had said it without saying it weeks ago. She doesn't do farewell laps. I reached the double doors of the hall and paused. Outside, sunlight bounced off the concrete like heat made visible. The wind carried salt. You could hear gulls even this far from the water. And then I saw it, a shadow standing near the gate, just beyond the chain link beside the flagpole. Still. Shoulders straight, hair pulled back. Maybe it was her. Maybe not. I didn't turn to check. Some salutes are never requested, only returned. I didn't turn around at the gate, but I remember the light catching the glass, how it softened the dog tag's edge until it looked almost mended. Some things don't need to be named to be remembered. Tamsin never asked for closure. She just gave the rest of us the tools to build it ourselves. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with applause, it arrives when silence finally feels safe. What she left behind wasn't just a legacy, it was permission for those forgotten, overlooked, or dismissed to stand again, even if no one claps. Have you ever been seen only after you stopped asking to be noticed? Share your story or stay a while and listen. And if this moved you, consider following the channel for more stories like hers.